Away from people, away from shelter, away from normalcy. Out in the middle of nowhere, you will find only the fleeting warmth of a dwindling campfire and roads that seem to circle back to nothingness. And yet, you're not alone, as somewhere out in that nowhere is something waiting for you to come a little bit closer, because it's hungry and you've got the only flesh for miles. Enjoy these allegedly true scary stories about the middle of nowhere. Stories that were set in an area away from civilization were considered for this episode. If you've got a scary story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org to have it narrated on the show. However, if you've got a terrifying encounter that happened at work, send your story to us at eeriecast.com/submit to be considered for narration on a new podcast, possibly with a new host. Now, let's begin. Dogman or Demons, from Dogman97. I live in the northeast of England, in a small village in the county of Durham. I am 24 years old, and this encounter happened when I was 17. I have had several encounters, but I think this may be the best story to start with. In the summer of 2015, me and my two friends, Jake and Ryan, decided to camp out in Castle Eden Forest. We brought with us some alcohol, and we also thought it would be a good idea to take a Bluetooth speaker with us. We arrived around 8 o'clock. It was still light out, so we decided on a spot and pitched our tents. This area was off track, uphill, and quite the hike, especially since we were carrying our tents, bags, and crates of beer. Nevertheless, we made it unharmed and excited for the night ahead. The first encounter that happened, I did not see, but both my friends did. Initially, I thought they were just trying to freak me out. The area where we pitched our tents was flat, but surrounded by trees and two hills. One of them was at an incline in front of us. The other was a sheer drop behind us and to the side. We had hiked up the safe way. While I was unzipping my tent bag, both my friends began cursing, and at first I thought they were arguing with each other. It was in a split second when I realized they were looking up at the hill and through the trees. "Did you see that?" Jake looked at me, and I replied by just shaking my head and going back down to unpack my tent. "That was weird," Ryan shouted. "What are you talking about?" I asked, thinking nothing of it. Then both my friends confirmed the same thing. When I look back on this now, I can say they were spooked, but not so much to have us all running back home already. Both my friends recalled to me seeing a big red wolf demon. That was both their words. They agreed on what they saw. Just a side note for a little perspective for the readers. We don't have wolves in the UK. The two of them described it as best they could, seeing it from a distance. They said it was red, like a rusty color, with shiny red eyes and a gray face. They said it moved like a dog, but then it hid behind a tree and used arms and hands to peer out from behind it. They then said it crawled like a man out of their sight. The night went on as usual, with them occasionally mentioning this wolf, and I kept hoping they were just pretending, because in all honesty, it started to freak me out the darker the night grew. Sometime around midnight, Jake mentioned the battery for his speaker was low. It was shortly after that when we all heard a collection of strange noises. They were loud enough that we could hear them over the speaker. So we kind of just sat there, listening and looking at each other, silently trying to figure out what it was we were listening to. We heard a low hissing sound at first. It went on for at least a minute, maybe a minute and a half. Then we heard thuds in the distance, followed by snapping twigs. Coincidentally, and I say that with all irony, because it sounds so cliché, but I assure you it happened, the speaker ran out of battery. I believe then my two friends went pale. I believe I also went pale listening to the sounds around us. I felt the blood rush to my face, my chest just locking up. I was so creeped out. I didn't want to breathe. I could literally hear my heartbeat. The hissing turned into a very sharp growl, like high-pitched, but it had an immense volume to it. Sorry if this is a bad description of the noise, but the best way I can describe it is that it was like the noise of an angry house cat. It had a sort of moan to it, but the growl had a bubbling sound. I know it sounds strange, but trust me, it was absolutely terrifying. To make things worse, another noise came from up the hill I mentioned before. Now, the best way to explain this noise was something big saying, "rot" or "rock." It was very deep. It reminded me of a gorilla. Then it just growled. It was a very low rumble. By the time this had happened, the other noise had stopped. We were absolutely petrified. We didn't know what was going on. The next thing that happened is possibly one of the scariest things I've ever experienced in my entire life. There was a sudden explosion of twigs and branches breaking, and there was 100% something running around in the trees. It was very heavy and very fast, and yet we could see nothing. Then it happened. It sounded like a dogfight. That's the best way I can explain it. Like a really violent, loud, and disturbing dogfight. It was so loud to the left of me, I jumped up to my feet and shouted at it. I had 1,000 things going through my mind, and I assumed it was someone out there playing a really good prank on us. Believe me when I say that when I shouted, "Stop it!" as loud as I could, you'd barely be able to hear it. The commotion went on for at least a couple of minutes. It felt like a lifetime. Now, I have no idea how we mustered the courage, but we all got up and we ran for it. We left our tents, our bags. Ryan left his mobile phone, and I left my house keys. We literally rolled down the hill to get away, and we sprinted for the exit. We have spoken about this encounter many times, and each time we tell it to people, they all strangely sort of believe us. It was too much to make up, and we all encountered and remembered the same things. So, after I actually looked into what it could have been, I'm pretty convinced it was a dogman. Ryan also believes it was a werewolf, or something of the sort, but Jake seems to think it was something else, perhaps a demon. A Dark Night in North Carolina, from Lapel Guy 9. This story happened around 12 years ago. I would have been around 15 back then. I grew up in a rural area of North Carolina. There wasn't really a lot to do growing up, but thankfully I had a few cousins that lived nearby, as well as my sister, so we found plenty of things to get into. It helped that we were relatively close in age as well. We lived in a pretty inconspicuous area, just a few family members or friends, and just a basic little stretch of road, which connected to a local state park. It was the kind of neighborhood where it was either someone you've known your entire life, or it was straight up family. Anyway, this happened around the end of July, whenever we were already gearing up to go back to school. My cousins, my sister, and I decided we were going to have one last bash before we headed back to school the following month. We decided that we were going to have a quote-unquote seance in the woods. If you go a mile or so behind my uncle's house, who lived directly behind us, there is what is officially called a psychiatric hospital, but in the spirit of total honesty, it was an asylum for the criminally insane. The individuals which lived in that psychiatric hospital were pretty nasty cases, the kind of people that the medical psychiatric industry were frankly too scared to deal with, so they stuck them in places like this to sort of get them out of the public. I know that living a mile from a psych ward, you can literally cut through the woods to get to, sounds like it would be all kinds of spooky fun. But it was never something that we cared or even talked about. I mean, it's not like we'd ever do anything to get sent there. Anyway, the patients were not treated very well there, and the staff was highly underqualified. But thankfully, we had a pretty good local sheriff's department, who kept a 24/7 eye on the place. So much so, there was armed officers on ATVs that would patrol the woods around the place, usually once a day, to make sure everything was as it should be. You have to understand that the vast majority of these patients were people who had already been in and out of the system, usually a couple of times before they arrived here. On this particular night, things just didn't really sit right. But as I stated before, we weren't skittish teenagers. This was a safe area, a place we knew well, and we were surrounded by friends, family, and law enforcement was nearby, so we were virtually fearless most 99% of the time. We sucked in our guts and soldiered on. My older cousin and my sister decided that we should go farther into the woods than we had ever gone before. After all, if we were going to do this, we needed to do it right. We had all of our, we'll say, makeshift seance supplies in our backpacks. We headed out into the woods and got to the spot in which we were going to have our seance. This was an area that my uncle had taken my older cousin a few summers before on a hunting trip. As we began to set everything up, we had a radio playing, as well as some large outdoor lanterns, the kind especially made for camping. We also had food, beer, cigarettes, and anything else we could steal from my uncle and not get caught. You know, all the fixings and trimmings to set up for a long night of fun. Before we even had a chance to begin our seance, we started to hear strange things in the woods. Being relatively unafraid, we assumed it was some kind of animal. We were obviously raised in the area, so that wasn't anything new. It was usually just something small like a raccoon or possum. We ignored the sounds and they stopped. Then we went back to our fun, laughing, drinking, smoking, and fixing to start the seance. Then, out of the blue, we began to hear a faint voice calling, "Hey, come here." This was not a voice from anyone in the group. So, naturally, we all assumed that someone had recorded something on their phone and they were just trying to scare us. We all just kind of shrugged it off. We were like, oh yeah, whatever. My oldest cousin continued with the seance until we heard it again. "Hey, come here." At this point, even though I was a bit younger than the rest of the group, I stood up and I spoke angrily to the group. "All right then, enough is enough. Whichever one of you is playing that crap on their phone, grow a pair and stick it down in front of the group." I had become kind of irritated that the seance was being ruined and interrupted. I was assuming someone was just out there messing with us and being rude. We all pulled up the home screens of our phones, letting each other investigate them. We also emptied our pockets, proving that it was none of us. The rational-minded would have assumed that one of us in the group simply cleared their phone off and set it down. But literally within 5 minutes, we heard the voice again. But this time it wasn't so vanilla, if you will. This time, it was angry, and it said, "Get over here, now." By then, we were all terrified. Frozen in fear, we looked at each other, and all at once, we ran. Leaving everything behind, we kept going and going, not even caring what direction we were going in. The longer we ran, the more the footsteps that were following behind us became faint. As the trees began to part, we saw bright flashing lights. Assuming we were approaching a road, we ran towards it, not caring if it was a wreck or a traffic stop. We just wanted a cop. As we broke the wood line, our hearts began to pound in terror, even harder than they already were. Then we saw what was in front of us. It was the psych ward. A cop stood in front of his car, then saw us and shined a light, saying, "What the heck are you guys doing? Don't you know a patient escaped? And there's a girl missing." We shuddered briefly, then broke down in tears and explained to him what was happening. Clearly seasoned on the job, the officer tried to calm us down, then told one of the younger officers to take us home. After what felt like hours of heck in the woods, it was finally over. After a 10-minute car ride, we were back at my uncle's house, like nothing had ever happened. The patient who had escaped was never given a name, nor were they ever apprehended. And the girl who I sadly knew, named Paige Campbell, was found dead off the highway going out of town by a patrol officer at around 6 the following morning. Paige had been a 17-year-old cheerleader. She and I had always got along pretty well, but we weren't incredibly close. Because an underage girl had been murdered that night, the cops tried to keep the whole situation quiet for the family's sake, because we all know how the media can get. Over time, it kind of just faded from memory, and life, as it so often and cruelly does, eventually moved on. Now to say that it was for sure the psych patient who killed her may be a stretch, or maybe just my own imagination. But you have to admit that between our experience in the woods and then later on the same night Paige ending up murdered, it's pretty darn strange and creepy. We oftentimes talk about that night and what could have been. It's honestly become a story we tell at almost every holiday get-together or family barbecue. Kind of our screwed up and twisted way of processing it, I guess. The vast majority of the time, I can just kind of look back at it like a memory of ignorant teen bliss. But other times, now that I'm an adult, the reality sets in about what could have really happened in those woods, and it chills me to the bone to think of what could have been. Paige's mom eventually moved out of town after a few years of strange stares and the "Oh honey, how are you?" the kind that small towns are known all too well for. The reality is, I don't think that any of us will ever be the same. Something like that changes you, shapes you, even breaks you. You can believe this story if you want, or call it bullcrap. Frankly, I don't care. This isn't the kind of thing you make up. I only ask, if you're going to be messing around in the woods, be careful. Wrong Turn from Mill 89715. What I'm about to share with you is something that happened to me a few months back. It felt like a dream, but I'm still not sure if it was a dream or not. The memory of it still terrifies me, and if it really wasn't a dream, then I fear that I may have narrowly escaped death. I live in the northern area of Canada, in a remote rural town about 10 miles away from the city, where I work as a real estate agent. I've been in the business for about 5 months now, and I love my job. I work the usual hours for a standard week. You know, the typical Monday to Friday 9 to 5. I always take the main highway to and from work, so as to save a little money for gas each week. A few months ago, after a really busy day at the office, I was on my way home from work. I had dealt with a lot of clients that day, and I had needed to stay back an extra hour and a half. It was a rough day, and I was eager to get home. As I made my way across the highway, I caught a glimpse of flashing red and blue lights ahead. I slowed down and discovered there had been a major accident on the highway. From what I could see, a large truck had overturned and was blocking off the main road. Just great, I thought. Exactly what I needed, a long wait in a traffic jam. I was about to slump back in my seat when I remembered that a short way up and to the left was a back road that would lead all the way back to my house. I was a little hesitant at first because I'd heard that this particular road and area was prone to carjackings, crashes, muggings, and a number of other unsavory incidents. But I decided that the road was better than waiting in this god-awful traffic for another 2 to 3 hours. So, as the line of cars moved on and I neared that road, I turned my car left and drove off down the winding path. Curiously, I noticed that no one else seemed to be taking the road I'd chosen, but I just shrugged it off. I wish I would have thought better of this earlier. The back road I was on was a few miles longer than the highway and runs through an area of thick and dense forest. I was about 3/4 of the way home when I heard this weird rattling sound. Feeling concerned, I pulled to the side and I stopped the car. Just as I did, there was a loud bang from the front of the car, and steam began to rise from the bonnet. Great, I thought. More to worry about. I got out to survey the damage, and the first thing I noticed was that it seemed unnaturally cold out. And I say this because we were currently in the middle of summer, and the temperature must have easily been barely above 0. But at that moment, I had more things to be concerned about. I checked over the damage to the car, and noticed that not only was the radiator shot, but one of my tires had blown, which explained that loud bang when I had stopped the car. Getting a little frustrated now, I dug out my phone, and I called up one of the major roadside assistance places in the city. When I finally got through, the man said it would be at least 2 hours for him to get to me, as he had dozens of other calls from around the city. With a sigh, I agreed to wait, and I hung up. I sat on the hood of my car playing the day over in my head. I was annoyed, to say the least. It was at this moment that the cold I had only barely noticed before seemed to register. Not only that, but the woods surrounding the road seemed eerily quiet. I shivered slightly, and I was just about to get back into my car to stay warm, when I froze, having just noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head to the left to see what looked to be a pair of bright yellow eyes disappearing into the dark. I shivered a little, again, remembering the stories about muggings and carjackings happening on this road, not to mention the countless wild black bears. Now, I'm a pretty tough person, and normally I could brush something off like this, but something felt wrong. As soon as the eyes disappeared, I had turned back to staring at the road for the moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Feeling nervous, I decided to take my phone out to call my sister to pick me up instead of just waiting for the tow truck to arrive. As the phone began to ring, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I started to get a very unpleasant feeling in my gut. The phone rang a few times, then crackled out and died. Forgetting the feeling for a moment, I walked away from my car holding my phone out in the air. I figured I must have lost my reception, and I decided to see if I could get a few bars by walking in a different direction. I hadn't planned to walk far from the car, as it was now getting dark. I must have walked 30 meters from the car when I froze again. My body had gone cold. Not the sort of cold you get from a chilly winter night, but a searing wave of cold. I felt like my blood had turned to ice. I lowered my phone and I looked up. A feeling of pure terror swept across my entire body. Crouched at the edge of the woods about 50 or so meters away from where I was standing was what appeared to be a pale, oddly malformed deer with glowing yellow eyes. Immediately I knew this was the thing that had been watching me. I stared at it for a moment, transfixed in terror. It was as I looked at the thing that I realized it wasn't a deer at all. It had antlers on its head like a deer, but its face was mutilated. It looked wrong. It almost resembled a human's face crossed with a deer's skull. There were clumps of flesh missing from its entire body, which appeared to be abnormally thin. Its long arms were tipped with impossibly long and razor-sharp claws. I took several steps back. I had no idea what I was looking at, but that unpleasant gut feeling I'd felt before was now overwhelmingly strong, and even from that distance, I could smell the foul stench of rotting meat. As I backed up a few more steps, the creature slowly began to rise. and that was when I noticed it was at least 8 feet tall. Unable to look away, I froze again, watching the creature in horror as its mouth opened and revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth that appeared to be covered in blood. As it opened its mouth, I'd expected it to let out a growl of some sort, but I was truly horrified when instead it spoke, not just with any voice, but with what sounded like the man from the tow truck service.
"Hey buddy, I'm almost at your location. If you stay where you are, I'll be with you in about 10 minutes.
The creature stopped speaking, then let out what sounded unmistakably like the laugh of a small child, mixed with the faint sound of a large guttural animal. It sounded like it was playing with me, but I had the feeling it wouldn't continue to do so for long. I backed away slowly towards my car, and for every step I took, the creature responded with a step forward of its own, matching my speed and pace perfectly. I stopped as I reached my car, noticing that I'd left the door open. I gently leaned down and pulled the pistol I kept in the pocket of the door out. As I removed the gun, I noticed the creature's ears twitched, and it spoke again, this time with a different voice. The voice of my sister, whom I had just called just moments ago.
"Hey bro, it's okay, don't be scared. I'm not gonna hurt you. Why don't you come closer?"
On pure instinct, I brought the gun up, firing 6 shots into the creature's chest. It screamed, the sound echoing all around. It sounded like something I could only make out to be between an agonized moose, a grizzly bear, and the terrified scream of a young woman. Then the creature charged at me. I turned and ran. I had no idea where I was going. I had dropped my phone, and I was running blindly in the darkness, desperate to get away from the monstrous creature that was chasing me. I could hear it behind me, gaining on me, getting closer and closer. The foul stench of rotting meat and death filled my nostrils, and I could hear the sound of its breath and its feet behind me as it gave chase. A wave of adrenaline hit me. I put on an extra burst of speed. As I was unable to see where I was going, I tripped over something in the dark and fell, sliding down what I could only think to be a large embankment on the edge of the forest. I tried to brace myself and stop my body from slamming into a tree. Eventually, I came to a stop and I passed out. I woke up feeling sore and bruised. Glancing around, it was that moment I noticed I was not lying in the middle of the woods, but I was back in my own bed. I blinked for a second, staring around the room. When did I get back here? The last I remembered was being chased by something across the back road I'd been driving on, and tripping over something, tumbling down the side of what seemed to be a large hill. I leapt out of bed, still trying to make sense of it all, when I realized I was in the same clothes I was in from when I was last awake, except my attire now was all dirty and torn. With the terrifying idea that what I had experienced last night may not have been a dream, I darted outside to see if my car, which had broken down, was in the driveway or not. Sure enough, there was my car sitting in the driveway, one tire still blown out from whatever I'd hit earlier. I checked under the hood to find that my radiator was still, in fact, blown. I was starting to feel a bit scared, because if what I was seeing in front of me was to be believed, then that means the previous night was real, and somehow I had mysteriously ended up back home, along with my broken down car and torn, dirty clothes. After this event, to this day, I still cannot explain what had happened or how I ended up back home. But occasionally, as I'm driving along the highway after work, having now gotten my car repaired, I swear that sometimes I can see a dark shape following along the tree line, or I'll catch a glimpse of what appears to be a pair of glowing yellow eyes watching from the tree line as my car goes by. I haven't seen the creature again, but I'm sure it's still out there, watching me and waiting for me. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.